Okay, so welcome to this session of the Leuven seminar, which will be devoted to a recent monograph by Jens Timmermann titled Kant's Will at the Crossroads, an essay on the failings of practical rationality. And the book was published with Oxford University Press in 2022. So before introducing our four speakers, I'd like to ask you to switch on your camera, if at all possible, because I think it's always more interesting and agreeable if everyone can see each other. And I also wanted to mention that we normally leave open the Zoom meeting after the formal part, so after 7 p.m., so that there will be an opportunity for more informal conversations. Yeah, so don't be desperate if you weren't able to ask your question during the formal part, because there will be more opportunities afterwards. So let me now welcome and introduce our speakers. And first of all, evidently, Professor Jens Timmermann. He is a professor of philosophy at St. Andrews, and he published many articles and books on Kant's practical philosophy. In addition to his recent monograph, I would like to mention a few of his publications, including a commentary on Kant's groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, published in 2007, and also a number of collections that he edited or co-edited, including the Cambridge History of Moral Philosophy, which was published in 2017. Finally, I would like to mention one of his recent articles, also on Kant, titled The Quandary of Infanticide in Kant's Doctrine of Rights, and this one was published in Archiv für Geschichte der Philosophie in 2022. So Jens Timmermann will present the main idea of his book for about 10 minutes. After that, three commentators will present their thoughts on various aspects of the book, and they will also have about 10 minutes to do so. So I would now like to introduce the commentators, and I'll do so in the order in which they're going to present their ideas. So first, Nicholas Dunn. He is a postdoctoral fellow at the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities at Bard College. His areas of research include Kant's ethics and contemporary political theory, with an emphasis on Hannah Arendt's thoughts. He published a number of journal articles on these subjects, including most recently an article in Kant-Studien titled Kant on Feeling and Judgment, which was published in preprint edition in 2024, so very recently. Anastasia Berg is an assistant professor of philosophy at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and her research focuses on moral philosophy and its history, especially as regards Kant and German idealism. She published a number of journal articles in these areas, including Kant on Moral Respect, published in Archiv für Geschichte der Philosophie in 2021, and she is the co-author of a forthcoming monograph titled What Are Children For? On Ambivalence and Choice. And this monograph will be published this summer. Our third commentator today is Robinson dos Santos. He is professor of philosophy at the Federal University of Pelotas in Brazil. And his many publications include the monograph Moralität und Erziehung by Immanuel Kant. Yeah, maybe there's some overlap with your forthcoming monograph on children, Anastasia. And he's also the co-editor of two volumes. The one is titled Realism and Anti-Realism in Kant's Moral Philosophy, New Essays, published with De Gruyter in 2018. And another one also published with De Gruyter in 2022, titled Kant's Theory of Value. Robinson is also the editor of Studia Kantiana and associated editor of the Journal of Ethics. So I can now hand over to Jens Timmermann, who will introduce the main theme of the book in about 10 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Karen. Thank you for making this event possible. And thanks, of course, to the three discussants for reading the book and prodding me a bit on its content. The book is about practical failure in Kant. So the basic question is, what goes wrong when things go wrong, when we mess up, when we do things we shouldn't do? And I think Kant says a lot about imperatives, about how they're constituted, about their normativity here and there, but he doesn't say that much about what happens when things go wrong, because he tends to sort of focus on the success case, more so than on failure of practical reason, broadly construed. This is a project that goes back many years, and my interest in failure goes back really to my student days, when I was really keen on Aristotle and Plato and Acrasia and different models. And historically, as many of you will know, there are two models. There's the Socratic model, namely, we always act in accordance with our judgment of what is best. And if we don't, that's a failure of knowledge or of judgment. We do not know that we mess up at the time of action. And in a departure from that, Aristotle in Book 7 of the Nicomachean Ethics comes up with a model that separates judgment of what is best up to a point, complicated, from what in the end we do. So we end up with a theory that accounts for, as we might say, acting contrary to our better judgment, which is impossible for Socrates, because when we mess up, we just don't have that better judgment available to us at the time. And I started thinking about this in terms of, well, you know, there are those two models. They're still strong in psychology. Today, we teach these models to undergraduates. What does Kant have to say about this? And after a while, it seemed increasingly clear to me that it might be worth pushing what I call the hybrid view, namely, there's no single model of practical failure in Kant, but rather in the realm of prudence, Kant is a Socratic intellectualist. When we act imprudently, it's because we don't know better. But in the realm of morality, Kant is, with many, many caveats, and I think in our discussions with Nicholas, this may come up, is kind of an Aristotelian in the moral realm. That is to say, I think it's fairly clear that we can wittingly, clear-headedly, knowingly violate moral norms in the kind of way that we can't wittingly, knowingly, clear-headedly violate prudential norms. So, or instrumental rationality in general. And if that's right, details to follow, of course. I think this is an interesting result in its own right, that there's no blanket theory of practical failure. There are two different accounts to be given for two different, as we might call them, spheres of normativity. And my main interest really was just putting this issue on the table, because it's very rarely discussed, and I'd never seen it discussed in terms of a hybrid view, that there's no blanket theory of practical failure in general. But there are some very interesting, I think, implications for Kant's practical philosophy as a whole. And at the end of the book, there's a summary in terms of theses. So if you want a shortcut to the content of the book, have a look at the last bit, and it's put in terms of reasserting dichotomies. And I think there's been a tendency in particularly English language scholarship in the last maybe 30, 40, 50 years to try to get rid of dichotomies in Kant. And I think we just need to put them back. Or at any rate, I think we need to discuss this openly and not just assume that the common view is the right view. So if there's no unified account of failure, practical failure, what follows is that there's no unified account of practical reason in a broad sense, pure and empirical either. So no single sphere of rational activity, practical normativity, what have you, because there's that fork in the road, prudence here, morality there. And if we look at the details, one thing that I'm committed to, and that's a departure from the line I took, for example, in the commentary in 2007. I no longer think that there's a single hypothetical imperative as a principle of practical reason. I think there are lots and lots and lots of individual hypothetical imperatives. So there's no principle that tells you to embrace the means when we intend the end. It's just that there's this imperative telling us to do this if we want that, and so on and so forth. And that in fact, what Korsgaard calls true irrationality is impossible in the realm of hypothetical imperatives. So we don't violate them knowingly. It's explicable in terms of our priorities or ignorance of the means or what have you, if we seem to violate them, but we don't knowingly violate hypothetical imperatives. As far as the pure side of things is concerned, as I said, it's a very different story because choice enters the equation at this stage, and choice here, which is something that Kant admits once in a while, and that may be philosophically problematic, I think ultimately is inexplicable. So we do not have a full-blown explanation, account of why we mess up morally. At some point, we just have to say, so-and-so chose to do this, end of story, brute fact. And what's interesting about that kind of two-pronged approach, I think, is that we sort of get an inversion of something that is at least implicitly often assumed in recent discussions, namely, on the one hand, that there is true irrationality in the case of hypothetical imperatives, that we can fail to be irrational in that sphere, and there's an element of inexplicability there. And that on the other hand, whenever we act morally, so whenever we act, well, whenever we act really, whether morally or immorally, but within the moral realm, we act under the guise of the good, i.e. we assume that our actions satisfy the categorical imperative. And I don't think that's the case either. I think we act either under the guise of the good or under the guise of the pleasant. But when we act under the guise of the pleasant, which I take to be the same as happiness, not a trivial equation either, of course, in that case, we do not think that we do the right thing or that our action is justified. So we can willingly choose immoral actions that we, on balance, judge not to be justified. And that is not the case in the prudential realm. Putting it like this, of course, points to the direction, again, of some modern tendencies. And this project came very much out of my discussions with Andy Reith, with whom I've got a lot in common, and he's a friend, of course. But I discovered that even though we share so many assumptions, it seems about practical failure, we just take the opposite view, because Andy's committed to a strong version of the guise of the good thesis. So that's part of his kind of constitutivism. We always think we satisfy principles of reason when we act, in particular, the categorical imperative, which is the principle, of course, of pure practical reason. And he's also committed to true irrationality in the realm of hypothetical imperatives. So I was sometimes tempted to call this book my anti-Andy. But of course, you know, we're friends and so on. But that's part of the history. Again, the other part of the genesis of this book is my interest in ancient philosophy, and together with Sarah Brodie, I taught a class on moral psychology, ancient and modern, and that's when this project, really a long time ago, of course, kind of took shape. Again, I'm not 100% committed to everything I say in this. I may sound slightly more confident in print than I may sound in the coming minutes and hours. But I think it's an important topic, and we should put it on the table for further discussion. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you very much for this introduction. I hand over to Nicholas Dunn.
Right. So it's great to be here, and thanks for the opportunity to engage with your work. I've been fortunate enough to have you comment on my work in the past and pose questions to me, and so I'm kind of excited to be able to return the favor. And there are a handful of issues that you've pushed me on in our past discussions, and I've always sort of been curious, like, to know, yeah, well, like, what do you think about these things? And so now seems like good enough time as any to do that. So by way of introduction, let me just say I enjoyed the book a lot. The account's clear, it's neat and tidy, it's attractive, I think, it's provocative, it's philosophically interesting. My focus in these comments is going to be sort of on the central claim of the book, which you just sort of summarized for us, the hybrid account that you advance in the book. And just to sort of review again, it's the idea that Kant has two answers to the question of why human beings fail to follow reason in their actions. One answer in the case of non-moral action, and another answer for the case of moral action. More specifically, again, as you just said, Kant is a Socratic intellectualist in the first case. We always act under the guise of the good when it comes to matters of prudence or unhappiness. But Kant provides a volitional account, maybe more Aristotelian account in the moral realm, which is to say that it's possible for us to represent an action as morally good or required and so on, but not do it. So at the outset, and I think you just said this as well, you state that the hybrid theory has ramifications for Kant's theory of practical reason as a whole. And so I want to sort of explore some of these in my comments in the discussion. The first pertains to how we think about the theoretical practical distinction for Kant in general. The second pertains to how we think about the process of practical reasoning, the overall process of practical reasoning in terms of the practical syllogism, and also Kant's account of judgment, in particular practical judgment. There's a sense in which my comments pertain more to what you don't say than what you do say. The notion of the practical syllogism, you invoke it on the very first page in the preface in connection with Aristotle and his famous idea that the conclusion is an action. But curiously, you never mention the notion of practical syllogism again in the rest of the book. So I'm interested in discussing the view that you defend in the book with regards to this, since it doesn't figure in your analysis. And I think the same can be said for the notion of judgment. So while the term judgment and related terms, judging, and these sorts of things are used throughout the book, you never discuss it in connection with Kant's theory of judgment in particular. Indeed, the typic section where Kant discusses practical judgment doesn't make any appearance whatsoever in the book. So whether these are going to amount to challenges to your view, as opposed to just simply invitations to elaborate and, as it were, translate your view into these particular kinds of terms, I'm interested to hear what you have to say in response. You draw heavily on passages from Kant's third critique concerning the proper meaning of the term practical, and by extension, what this means for the distinction between the theoretical and the practical. Perhaps counterintuitively to some, Kant means something quite specific by practical. I mean, I think we agree on this. In distinguishing between the technically practical and the morally practical, Kant says that only the latter is truly practical. The former includes what he calls rules of skill, counsels of prudence. And so while these are imperatives, they are ones in which the ought is grounded in the fact that, as Kant says in the groundwork, and you mentioned this in the book, whoever wills the end also wills the means. So the technically practical merely says what actions are required in order to bring about a certain effect. So when I set certain ends for myself, the specific actions that I ought to do to achieve these ends are entirely derivable, Kant says, from theoretical philosophy. So empirical knowledge, facts about the world, and so on. And so what separates the technically practical from the morally practical is the determining grounds of the will. In the former case, it's a concept of nature, Kant says. In the latter case, it's a concept of freedom or moral concept. And this distinction maps, I think, directly onto the distinction between the hypothetical and categorical imperatives. So while judgments might appear to be practical insofar as they're about action, right, the content of the judgment, what matters actually is whether the principle is a law of nature or a law of freedom. Now, commentators have debated whether the practical syllogism is useful as a model for understanding Kant's account of practical reasoning as a whole. Some, for example, have suggested that maxims serve as the major premise. I'm wondering, in general, if your account is amenable to being described in such terms. Kant himself invokes the notion of the practical syllogism twice, once in the Second Critique, and again in the Metaphysics of Morals. In the former text, in the Critique of Practical Reason, he describes it, quote, as proceeding from the universal in the major premise, the moral principle, through undertaking in a minor premise a subsumption of possible actions as good or evil under the former, to the conclusion, namely the subjective determination of the will, an interest in the practically possible good, and in the maxim based on it. So I think a few questions arise for your account. First, given your insistence on the sharp distinction between pure and empirical reason, is the practical syllogism only relevant for the former? And does the latter take place in the context of a theoretical syllogism? And if so, how is this compatible with the claim that it is in fact only in the case of non-moral action that actions directly follow from judgments? So how does a theoretical judgment immediately produce an action? That is, how does the conclusion of theoretical syllogism necessarily determine the will? Now, at one point, you state that while the non-moral cases derive their authority from the theoretical domain, they nonetheless contain what you call practically relevant propositions. And so if the one suggestion I just made or line of thinking is not welcome, we could maybe instead say that there are two kinds of practical syllogisms corresponding to the moral and the non-moral cases. In the former case, you might say that the conclusion is a judgment concerning an action which may or may not determine the will, which is to say I could refrain from performing this action. Whereas in the latter case, you would want to say, I think that the conclusion is an action, or minimally that it is a judgment regarding an action from which the action necessarily follows. All this to say, how exactly does the hybrid, or what does the hybrid account entail for the practical syllogism? And relatedly, where does this put Kant with respect to Aristotle? One through line in the book is the relationship between judgment and action. For Kant, as I was sort of suggesting, we individuate judgments based on their principles, not on their content. So a practical judgment is practical not because it is about action, but because it is determined by a moral principle. By contrast, a judgment about, say, the quickest way to get to the grocery store or something like this is in fact theoretical, despite setting out the proper means to achieve an end. So in the context of practical failure, only one is the failure of judgment. In the non-moral case, we err in our judgment about what would make us most happy or the relevant means to a particular end. Whereas in the moral case, we make a correct judgment about what we ought to do. The failure is not cognitive, but volitional. So as I noted, you don't much discuss the notion of judgment in particular, at least in the context of the faculty of the mind that Kant sees as responsible for producing judgments in general, what he calls the power of judgment. And here we can, I think, distinguish between the colloquial sense of the term judge or judgment and the more technical sense referring to the particular faculty of the mind, the power of judgment. So the former is, what we mean when we say things like doing what we judge to be best or acting against our better judgment, this sort of thing. And Kant will speak sort of in this looser, colloquial, broad sense of judge and judgment when he refers to the judgments of reason or reason and its judgments of what we ought to do, these sorts of terms that are all over the practical philosophy. But of course, Kant also defines a particular faculty that he calls the power of judgment, has the faculty of subsuming under rules, or the faculty of thinking the particular under the universal. And this is, in fact, the power that he invokes in the typic section of the second critique, which, as I noted, doesn't feature in your discussion, but it's a section devoted to the issue of practical judgment. And there he defines practical judgment as a matter of determining whether an action possible for us in sensibility is or is not a case that stands under the rule, in which what is said in the rule universally, in abstracto, is applied to an action in concreto. And he will go on to describe practical judgment as the subsumption of an action possible to me in the sensible world under a pure practical law. So one question is simply, what do you take practical judgment to be for Kant? And I think while there are some similarities between the theoretical and the practical cases for Kant, he also will point out that there are some important differences. The former subsumes already existing or given objects under concepts, while the latter, practical judgment, is productive of its object. Yet it seems that insofar as both the moral and non-moral cases concern action, they both seek to be the cause of the existence of their objects. So then what does this mean for how we think about not just the theoretical practical distinction, but about how practical judgment fits or is situated within Kant's overall conception of practical reason? In your discussion of Kant's distinction between Wille and Willkür, you seem to place judgment squarely with the former, namely the legislative capacity of reason. The latter, which is our power of choice, consists in our ability to decide whether or not to follow the law. And in this, and in your in the 10th step, sort of in that genealogy chapter, the relevant move, as you describe it, is from the categorical imperative to a maxim. And I think many commentators, O'Neill, Herman, others, will characterize practical judgment primarily in terms of deriving duties from the categorical imperative or applying the categorical imperative in order to formulate and adopt eventually a maxim, which is also a general principle. So to return to the original idea, the question of whether it's possible to act against our better judgment or our judgment of what seems best or good. The hybrid account, I think, is intelligible in the context of an ambiguity between, or an ambiguity in the word good, right? A difference between the morally good and on the one hand and the agreeable on the other. But I think there's a further ambiguity in the notion of judging what we ought to do, namely between a kind of action and a specific action. Perhaps we could think of this in terms of the type token distinction, right? So what we ought to do in terms of a particular type of action, say lying in the abstract, or a specific action like telling this particular lie or uttering this particular speech act in this particular situation that I'm in. And so I'm curious to know where you think practical failure takes place with respect to this distinction. So is it that we choose not to proceed any further from our abstract grasp that some certain act type might be permissible or prohibited or so on? Or is it that we conceive of a relatively specific act token, but stop short of performing it? In terms of the practical syllogism described, is the conclusion an act type or an act token, right? So do we start with a maxim in the major premise that you might say describes, insofar as it's a general principle, describes types of actions, and then we arrive at a conclusion that prescribes a particular act token? And just to conclude, I think this in turn has implications for how we understand Kant's claim that, right, as he says, it's easy for us in all cases to know what we morally ought to do. I think we can ask, in what sense exactly is this the case? So you'll say at one point, quote, a clear sense of what we morally ought to do does not determine action, end quote. But might this not only be due to, say, frailty or weakness, but also due to an inability to know which precise action to take in order to fulfill a duty? If so, then the difficulty of morality is not only volitional, but also cognitive, determining the means to enacting a principle of duty one is committed to, and which is itself easy to be aware of. In other words, it seems as if technically practical or prudential reasoning is required for the achievement of a moral end. So I'm curious to know whether you think that this skill, you might say, kind of art, right, judgment that Kant speaks of, is moral in character or is morally neutral, right? If the moral moment is the commitment to a maxim, which says something regarding general types or kinds of actions, and then figuring out how to instantiate it is just kind of a purely cognitive, non-moral moment in agency. And also, I think just based on things we've talked about in the past, how this relates to the distinction between perfect and imperfect duties, right? The latter admitting much greater latitude with how to fulfill them and apply them, and therefore I think also requiring more of a need for judgment. So I will conclude my remarks there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. There is a lot in there. It was very interesting, very dense. Jens, I don't think it will be possible to address all of this in
No, thank you. I think there's another book there that I'm not going to sketch in 5 minutes. But thank you very much, Nick. This was a very, very rich set of comments. And as you've been saying, we've been discussing related matters on and off for some time now. Let me try to at least outline some answers. I think first of all, you're spot on right that there are many things I don't discuss and I don't say, mainly because there are footnotes occasionally saying, I don't want to discuss this any further, because I think the book as it is has a kind of unity, and it is a long essay, right? And I was worried at various points that I would just stray too much from the main theme. So I do take for granted a judgment used in a token sense, I think. So how the token judgment, I ought to do this here and now, comes about is something that I touch on occasionally, but you're quite right that I don't discuss it in detail. And the typic I don't touch on precisely because I take it to be about how we arrive at the token judgment of I should do this, maybe first in the abstract, the level of maxims. And then, of course, there's a separate step from maxims to concrete imperatives. But the typic, it seems to me, is a version of the universal law formulation. And again, this is a discussion worth having, but it wasn't so much my focus for this project. But in terms of your question, so the notion of judgment presupposed is the notion of all things considered, here and now, judgment. This is what reason wants me to do, or this is what I have reason to do, or this is what I ought to do, or something like that. And then we have to discuss as to how we get there, right? In terms of the practical, well, the word is just ambiguous in many ways. I don't think it's viciously ambiguous, but I think it's ambiguous, and the ambiguity can be explained in terms of Kant's own philosophical development, because he started out with a broader notion of practical, also practical reasons. So everything's practical in that sense, if it leads not to some cognition, but rather to an action, or maybe to an action prescription. More about that when we turn to syllogisms in a minute. And the narrow notion of practical, which is really only relevant once autonomy enters the scene, is reason by itself determines action. And what reason does could not have been done by any other capacity, could not have been done by instinct, by inclination, or anything like that, right? And there's a tendency in Kant from the groundwork onwards to narrow things down to pure practical reason, to morality, because that's when reason by itself really determines what we should do. But he still uses the broader notion. He still, of course, has hypothetical imperatives that are practical in the sense that they pertain to action and they don't stay purely theoretical. And it's easy to see what it would be for a hypothetical imperative to be purely theoretical. It wouldn't be an imperative in that case. For example, if I want to make something I don't particularly say, a Bucks Fizz, right? And I don't at the moment want to drink one. That will be theoretical for me because it doesn't issue in any kind of action prescription, let alone an action for me to go to the fridge and grab the orange juice and grab the bubbly and make a Bucks Fizz. That's theoretical. It becomes practical only once I have an interest in the outcome. I think this is an ambiguity that unfortunately we have to live with. And in the case of morals, the gap is meant to be closed, of course, by autonomy, because of autonomy, the question whether this law pertains to me doesn't arise in the same way that the question arises for laws of nature that I import into my will that are practical by virtue of that. Final note, skipping ahead to your last question, again, I was talking about failure in terms of facing token prescriptions, bracketing the question of how we got there. And I half suspect, I think it's a very interesting point, right? Might things not go wrong? May be in the case of imperfect duty more so than in the case of perfect duty, because there the rules are clearer. Might things not go wrong because we subsume falsely? But in the moral case, at least, Kant has that fabulous capacity called conscience, that if we go wrong, warns us, and I mentioned this in passing in a few passages in the book, think harder, right? Which, of course, is hugely problematic and hugely optimistic. But I think Kant would say the transition from the general to the token, if the problems might occur, is a matter for conscience, and conscience step in and warn us that we have to think again and think harder. Practical syllogism, mainly Aristotelian, it seems to me, though we can apply it for the reason that you mentioned, namely Aristotle doesn't have a robust notion of free choice in the way that Kant does. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So we now turn to Anastasia Berg.
Hi, thank you so much, Karen, for having me. And thank you, Jens, for this great opportunity. When I was reading the book, I was reminding of a comment that a professor of poetry when I was in college made. And he said there are some poets who make you feel very paralyzed, and some poets have the air guitar effect, which is as you're reading the poetry, you want to take a guitar and go along. And I really felt that way reading the book. And I think one of the reasons is actually the fact that it is a unified essay with a goal, and something about the kind of single-minded drive of it, and both the combination of historical and philosophical research I thought was just so, I wanted to take up my guitar and go and play along. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to focus my comments on Jens' argument for the intellectualism about instrumental rationality in Kant. And I'd like to start by saying that in the course of studying Jens's arguments, I find myself enjoying a rare pleasure, which is why I then wanted to pick up my own imaginary guitar, which is that of being persuaded by a position that I, if not so much, actually opposed prior to this engagement. I was certainly very suspicious of. So I'm very grateful, both locally, because I've learned something and I have a new conviction, but also more broadly, like this is possible. Rational persuasion is still real. So, but that this has in fact occurred is not going to be obvious to you from the tenor of my actual comments, because I'm going to open by raising what will no doubt look like an objection. And it's going to be by means of a counterexample. At the end, however, I'm going to argue that this objection doesn't need to be taken as an objection to intellectualism about instrumental rationality, but maybe it's going to have to be taken as an objection to the conception of happiness that Jens relies on. And so I'm going to give him that choice. I'm going to ask him which horn of the dilemma, which way in the crossroads he wants to go. I suspect he's going to try to deny the choice is a necessary one. So without further ado, Jens claims, here's a representative quote. He does it obviously throughout the book. This is from page 109. It is in fact impossible for us as human beings willingly to violate the one end we actually have, happiness, by choosing not to realize the option we take to contribute to that end most at the time of choice. Now, a central case that Jens considers Central, especially in sort of the first half of the book, the first 2/3, is one of baking bread. So knowing I want the bread, setting out to bake the bread, I'm a good baker, but then ending up settling for a stale loaf because I'm too hungry to make it, or who knows why. Here, both goals, both means serve my end, the stale loaf and the freshly baked one, nourishment, giving new circumstances, increased hunger, my fatigue. It means the means most appropriate change. But in what follows, I'd like to raise the following worry. The standard cases for what we call weakness of will, and so the paradigmatic examples of potential instrumental irrationality, they're not really like that. I think they're usually cases where something like a significant change of end occurs that it was responsive, not just to changing circumstances. Oh, I got more tired. I now have more reason to do one thing rather than another, but to something that we tend to describe as temptation, at least experientially, and cases where the originally held end, so say my health or the integrity of my marriage, is sacrificed, not because one realizes some intermediate end would be better served by having a fried Mars bar or cheating on one's spouse with the neighbor, but for all the agent herself would say, against her better judgment. Of course, at this point, one could always tell a story at a high enough level of abstraction where the agent has merely changed her mind, which is what Jens recommends that we do on behalf of Kant, about what her happiness actually consists in. But I think this comes at the cost of significant violence to an agent's self-conception, which in these cases, which I think are the paradigmatic ones, goes something like this. I'm not really giving up on health or my marriage. I'm well aware how these actions serve neither. I just can't really resist. Now, there is no doubt something admirable about the agent who, at this point, where this is what she would say about herself, admits that her wavering about the means shows a lack of commitment to the end. So we think it's right that the agent does not claim to be simply overwhelmed by literally irresistible desires, and hence sort of throw off the idea of moral responsibility as if giving in to temptation were the same as being taken possession of by an evil spirit. We wish to see that agent take responsibility for their giving in to temptation, for their giving in is sort of the question we ask, what does that mean? And part of that involves being honest about the way in which these means underserve the end they recognize as good. I don't think this is the same as saying that we hope the agent, that we would label this action a change of mind. Now, are these cases, though, of practical irrationality? And I want to raise a couple of reasons to think they actually are. So one reason to think they are is that what's crucial in these cases is that the goodness of the end underserved by these new means might not simply be a felt one, but a reasoned one. So in the cases I named, I pursue my health or I pursue integrity of my marriage. I'll continue with my health as an example. I don't pursue it just because I've enjoyed health once and I felt nice. And so I wish to have it again. I pursue it because I have what I think is a very firm grasp of all the ways in which my happiness depends on it. In fact, it requires it. And it's with a view to that grasp of the link between health and happiness that or happiness and the integrity of my marriage, that the current choice seems, well, irrational. So my first contention is that there is a case, one that Jens, I think, doesn't focus on. I'm going to talk in a second about something I think very similar he does talk about, that seems to fit awkwardly with his position he attributes to Kant. And I want to, before moving on, raise another consideration for this claim, that this is in fact the paradigmatic cases and they are cases of instrumental irrationality. So Jens mentions in a couple of places that one of the things that characterizes the rational failure involved in not following the categorical imperative is that it's something that involves reluctance. So he writes, Kant indicates that we gladly obey, gerne gehorchen, instrumental imperative thus invoked to realize our ends, whilst we do not gladly obey the imperative of duty. And he has another example in a footnote on page 88. Moral constraint presupposes that we do something reluctantly, unlike the case of instrumental rationality. And the thought is, well, because there's no reluctance when we change that, our action, that sort of indicates that, in fact, we're just serving the same end by different means. We just change our mind. So this is Jens, we're not reluctant to take care of our happiness because it involves considerations that are commensurable. But I think in the cases I pointed to, we may be really not happy about obeying or disobeying. So in fact, both can be painful. I may go to the dentist really reluctantly, complaining, I'm dragging my feet, following that instrumental rationality principle. And I may actually be crying over my tub of ice cream, wallowing in self-pity. It was recommended to me to give you as an example a moment from South Park when, who's the evil one? Cartman makes another kid who's really sad about being overweight eat chocolate, and the kid is just crying while he's eating the chocolate. And I said, I'm not going to show this at Karen's seminar. That would be too much. But that is the example. He's doing this. He knows he shouldn't. This is miserable. There's nothing. There seems to be a lot of reluctance involved, and you can imagine reluctance going in the other way as well. Now, a more complicated example that Jens does consider is, of course, the gout sufferer. I'm going to skip some of the quotes in the interest of time. But the point is, I'll do one. The choice the gout sufferer faces is that between complex, inclusive ideal with its manifold of rules of prudence and the immediate results of acting on a single inclination, which criteria he should apply. But he says the problem is precisely no option is clearly preferable on rational grounds. This is not a clash between reason and inclination. Then we found that, of course, there is a perspective from which the gout sufferer should forgo the meal, and that's the moral one. So what looks like a failure to act on instrumental imperatives has been, this is Jens, quote, reinterpreted as an immoral choice. And this I need to quote because I'm going to use this. So this is Jens. Quote, the inclusive substantive conception of happiness, which accords a prominent role to health, can acquire moral relevance in exceptional circumstances because neglecting it carries the risk of misery and subsequent moral temptation. So from the moral standpoint, we see this as a case of irrationality. This is something the gout sufferer has to admit, even if he takes the view that the bird in the hand is likely to be prudentially preferable. Under these circumstances, there is an indirect duty to pursue the substantive overall conception of happiness and not to seek happiness in the realization of a single risky desire. Okay, so once we turn the case, once we moralize the case, now we can recognize the case of the kind of irrationality that we think it is. I want to suggest at this point, the fact that only when we moralize the choice can we capture the sense of irrationality with which we view it is actually a general one. So I think this challenge that I'm posing, remember I said I'm going to raise an objection, but actually I don't think it's necessarily an objection to the idea of instrumental irrationality. Maybe it's something else. So I think there are two ways of responding to what I raised, if you find this persuasive. The first is to concede that rational instrumental failure is in fact possible for the reasons I outlined. But another is to classify all these cases and to reinterpret all these intuitions I've been giving about the health choice, about the integrity of my marriage choice, the gout sufferer, Cartman, and Camp, is to classify them as moral failures, and thereby to recognize the extent to which we may present them, what may present itself, or perhaps what we would be inclined to interpret as non-moral commitments aimed at promoting our happiness, so that commitment to health or the integrity of our marriage, have in fact already always been moral. In such a case, standing subordination of happiness to the moral life would be grounding a restriction on the possibility of reinterpreting what happiness might mean to us. So that's why we can't just reinterpret happiness in these cases, just kind of any which way on a whim or in the presence of a temptation. It is, and this is now I said, it's going to be nice, and then now we're going to raise another objection. It is, however, then I'm going to end. It is, however, unclear how the moral relevance acquired. So let's go back to the gout sufferer example. Understood along the lines Jens gives us, renders the original calculation actually faulty. So if the happiness that was sought is still just the same, just restricted by considerations of permissibility, So it's still pleasure, but only permissible pleasure. Wouldn't the same calculation hold? Wouldn't the choice of the sumptuous meal be as rational? How does the moralization of happening along these lines of just restricting it to permissibility change? And this is Jens, quote, the risk of misery and subsequent moral temptation. I think, to put my cards on the table, that Kantian happiness will have to be reinterpreted, not as a matter of experiential hedonism, which is what Jens argues for in the beginning of the book, nor simply as a matter of desire satisfaction, which is what his opponents argue for. We must rather ask ourselves, what would a full-blown, rationally practical agent be concerned with as far as their satisfaction with their condition, i.e. with their lives, involves? The answer to that, I think, is first and foremost the realization of their moral ends. So they're not just concerned with good willing in the sense of forming good intentions. They're concerned with good execution. They want to know, are these things that I'm committed to qua practically rational agent, am I getting to realize them in the world? This must be the core of a concern with one's well-being. And then only secondarily will an agent, so this is Concha Jens, who says first of all, we have the inclination putting, all the deliberation starts with inclination, all action starts with a concern for happiness. But I think only secondarily will an agent be concerned with the gratification of inclinations and desires they just happen to have by virtue of their nature and personal history. I've argued for this on other grounds, but notice this, understood thus, the happiness is no longer reducible to a pleasure sum calculation. It's now not hard to see why the gout sufferer's choice of the meal is in fact the wrong one, which I think the original understanding of happiness just doesn't give us. If health is conceived wholly as the enabling condition for the execution of virtue, there is far less of a question about the worthiness of the risk of the displeasure implied by foregoing the good. So I'm going to end there, and I'm going to turn to Jens and say, which horn of this dilemma are you going to take, Jens?
Thank you so much. Once again, very difficult to do justice to your comments in 5 minutes, but I think you've put your finger on a very important problem. I suspect, though, it's a problem for Kant and not for me. I hope it's a problem for Kant, in that intellectualist conceptions of failure tend to be sort of implausible prima facie. I'm going to defend the view, I think, at least up to a point, when it comes to things that look dissimilar and may therefore instill some kind of reluctance, but that, Kant would have to say are in fact similar because there's only one currency. So I think the important passage here is much more explicit in the second critique than in the groundwork, the gold analogy, which I discuss in some detail, the examples that occur in the context of the gold analogy, and generally the idea that, well, there's a common currency, and when it comes to happiness, it's the common currency that we're using, and not that other currency, namely the currency of morality, which is in a different realm altogether. And I think you also quite rightly said that the giving in has to be a matter not of being overcome by irresistible desire, but literally irresistible desire, but there has to be some element of lapsing or choice, and it can't just be like you're drugged or literally out of your mind. So I think that is the difficulty. And I was going to say, when you mentioned the spouse example, that's a case we can easily moralize. So it seems pretty clear from the start that just focusing on the non-moral aspects, the philosophic aspects of the spouse example, seems somewhat artificial. And maybe the way that even focusing in the case of the two gallows cases, in the first case on the non-moral aspect seems somewhat artificial. But I think that's precisely the example I would like to reintroduce at this stage and say why I think that there's at least some prima facie plausibility to the Socratic view after all. Because remember, the first part of the gallows case is a case where allegedly, as the example is set up, it's crystal clear what's in your interest. And Kant seems to be saying, well, in that case, there's no choice. It's just a matter of figuring out, which is normally very difficult, what I should do to be happy. Here, it's clear what I need to do, namely desist from the plan that initially I thought was irresistible. But in fact, I was mistaken about that. It's not irresistible, this desire of mine. Rather, it's resistible because it's been made clear to me that this would be to my disadvantage long term because I would be hanged. So I find it in a problematic sense unimaginable that someone in that situation would not do what he or she sees is in his or her best interest. So conversely, of course, I'm tempted to say in your marriage case, well, we don't know. We still think that we might get away with it. We don't know that this will wreck our marriage and our philosophic prospects if we do such things. So there's the gap there that allows inclination to persuade us for a bit, because we change our mind later, to do what on balance is unlikely, but not certain, to be bad for us philosophically. And okay, what about our moanings when we do it, saying, I know I shouldn't be doing this or something like that? Well, the question is, traditionally, I suppose, how quickly can you oscillate between the correct judgment and the mistaken judgment? Of course, if you oscillate, you still act on the mistaken judgment. But I agree that this is not exactly an adequate account of the phenomenology of imprudent action. And I think this is the big problem for any kind of intellectualist Socratic view, which shouldn't, mean that we don't want to ascribe this view to Kant, because we can ascribe problematic views to Kant. And in other areas, we willingly do it. And I leave it to people here to come up with examples of that. So the fact that we find a view criticizable doesn't seem to mean we shouldn't ascribe it to Kant. And for me, okay, so what's the bigger problem? The oscillation or the inexplicability if you can act contrary to your better judgment philosophically? And for me, the inexplicability would be the worst problem. And that's just a call of judgment to return to Nick's topic. So I think that is the bad thing. If we can't explain an action at all, okay, I have to bite the bullet of going back and forth quickly between two kinds of judgment. One final note, I've done 5 minutes already. Can we moralize our conception of happiness, which is what you touched upon towards the end of your presentation? I'm skeptical, but I wouldn't want to rule it out. I think, as the example that you mentioned has shown, as the gout sufferer shows, many things that seem to be morally irrelevant are indirectly, in some shape or form, morally relevant. After all, certainly, there's a gap between that I don't discuss much, judging this to be philosophically adequate and doing it, because we must still overcome the threshold of moral permissibility, right? So it's not automatic. I must also judge it, or in fact, act contrary to my better judgment morally, that the act that is philosophically conducive to my well-being is also morally permissible. So I'm skeptical, but I'm happy to explore it further.
Okay, thank you very much. Robinson dos Santos, it's your turn. And please unmute yourself. Yeah.
First of all, I would like to say thank you, Karin and Luis Felipe, and to greet my colleagues, Nick and Anastasia, and Professor Timmermann. We met first time in Siegen. I don't know if you remember. Okay, I would like to divide my presentation. First of all, please apologize my terrible accent. I would like to divide my presentation, which will be very brief, into 3 parts. First, I will begin with some more general considerations about the book. Second, I will make some observations about chapter 2 on happiness and some aspects that connect with prudence. And third, I will conclude with some questions or doubts on my part for the author. And I would like to hear Professor Timmermann about these points. As always, I'm referring to the author's various papers and books. Professor Timmermann offers a work that is fluent to read, accessible even to readers not initiated in Kant, and at the same time contains careful and detailed analysis of the topics deal with. So my compliments to the author for this beautiful and valuable work. First of all, the book deals with a very thought-provoking and in fact little analyzed topic in the field of Kant research, namely the question of moral failure or practical error. And right from the start makes its approach very clear. Timmermann's reading proposes that Kant has a hybrid theory of moral failure made up of a double dimension, a Socratic intellectualism in the field of prudence and an anti-intellectualist or volitional interpretation of immoral action. However, already in the preface, which is also reinforced at the end of the book, the author refers to the dichotomy between pure and empirical reasons determining the will, which go hand in hand with many other dualisms and dichotomies, which, whether we like it or not, so Timmermann's words, continue to define Kant's mature ethical thought, end quote. I recognize that I identified myself among those who don't like dualisms and dichotomies, Professor Timmermann. And I understand and agree that Kantian terminology offers elements for this mode or this kind of interpretation. However, I ask you whether here, as indeed in that session you present at the end, inspired by Rawls, whether things necessarily have to be read in this way, that is, as a dichotomous or and necessarily as dualistic. Wouldn't that, as well as the very famous and for many, like romantics, for example, almost incomprehensible distinction between phenomenon and thing in itself, mean making things irreconcilable at the end? Or simply put, wouldn't we be forcing a platonizing or even humanizing reading of Kant here? In particular, and as an example in this context, I would like you to consider the sensible, intelligible distinction. It is also dichotomous and dualistic in the same sense that you propose. Are these concepts always applied in the very same meaning? This question, it seems to me, is given much more as a distinction, or if you prefer, a double perspective, let's say a perspectivism, yet of one and the same object. By endorsing this separation, which is the very meaning of dichotomy, how can we still understand ourselves about the idea of the unity of this being, in this case, the human being, who is both rational and sensitive or natural? In chapter 2, a sentence caught my attention right at the beginning. Practical normativity, you say, prudence and ultimately moral judgment, motivation, and choice is a reaction of reason to the demands of sensibility, end quote. At first, it is not difficult to understand how this idea fits into your considerations. However, it seems to me that if this consideration is taken literally as it stands, Reason seems to be a merely passive faculty that is incapable of doing anything on its own, unless provoked by sensibility. So here I would ask, what is the meaning of this expression, reaction of reason in this context? Finally, I would like to give your thoughts on the possible ambivalence of prudence in relation to morality, which I will comment on below. In the second critic, Kant states that the principle of happiness can undoubtedly provide maxims, but never those that would serve as laws of the will, even if universal happiness were taken as the object. End quote. In other words, prudence, because of its commitment to happiness and therefore because it is guided by human inclinations, is out of question in the field of morality. This is because it would be an heteronomous principle. It is not the free will principle of autonomy that draws the principle of will from itself, but it would come from something external and therefore foreign to itself. In this sense, there is a clear incompatibility between prudence and morality in Kant. Here, I remember a remark made by Professor Reinhard Brandt when he said that, quote, prudence succumbs in Kant, so we can paraphrase his doctrine, to the veto of morality. What is prudent but not moral will be sovereignly and unconditionally eliminated, however prudent it may be, end quote. On the other hand, could there be an approach to the compatibility between prudence and morality? Two topics could be mentioned to answer this question, I think. Finally, I would like to give your thoughts on the possibility, on the possible ambivalence of, I would like to hear you better say it, about this, no? On the possible ambivalence of prudence in relation to morality, which I will comment on below. The first aspect to highlight is already contained in the argument of the groundwork itself and is later taken up in the doctrine of virtue. In other words, prudence can also be understood as a factor that may contribute to the moral improvement, moralische vervolkoming as mentioned, of human beings. In other words, it would not be something always and necessarily contrary to morality, but could contribute to its realization and in the world of experience to the extent that it obeys and is guided by it. Prudence would no longer be understood exclusively from the perspective of hypothetical imperatives, but rather in the context of the duty to cultivate and exercise talents and abilities. In this sense, Kant argues in the doctrine of virtue that, I quote, if of the perfection corresponding to man as such, precisely to humanity, it is said that it is a duty in itself to propose it as an end, then it must be placed in what can be effect of his action, not in what is merely a gift that he must thank nature for otherwise it would not be a duty. It can therefore be nothing other than the cultivation of his faculties or natural dispositions, among which the understanding as the faculty of concepts and thus also of those that concern duty is the supreme faculty, and also the cultivation of his will, moral way of thinking, to fulfill all duties in general, end of quote. Maybe this last point goes beyond the purpose of your book, but I would like to hear your position about it. And thank you once again for the space and the invitation. Apologize for having to leave after this session because I have seminar in the sequence. So.
Okay, but Robinson, thanks. I hope you can still be here during Jens' response. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much for those very, very stimulating comments. And I think we may have more in common than may at first appear. I mean, on the note of dualisms and dichotomies, I think you're right. I mean, Kant tends to overemphasize them, or maybe he seems to sometimes underestimate the problems that dichotomies provoke. And I think this is kind of a theme in the history of philosophy, really, right? You know, and a theme that's sort of familiar from the dialectic of the first critique. We've got the idea that we need, due attention to different kinds of things, and that therefore we shouldn't homogenize too much. On the other hand, when we have two principles as philosophers, we would like to see whether they can be combined or reduced to one thing. And of course, if we have monism, the danger is that we don't sort of pay due attention to details. And when we have a dualism, we have the difficulty that we may want to mitigate between the two positions. I think the upshot of this may well be skepticism in the end. And I've been heading in that direction for some time. Unfortunately, of course, I'd have to probably resign my job if I were to become a skeptic. So I am not inclined to do it for a decade and a bit. But maybe, who knows, after that. So I think you're quite right to put your finger on this problem. And I think another example, and I discussed this in passing, at least in the book, is that Kant keeps telling us hypothetical imperatives in the interest of inclination, right? He aligns hypothetical imperatives with sensibility and the categorical imperative, obviously, with reason. But that can't be right, because in order, for example, to be beneficent, I need to draw on hypothetical imperatives, maybe even sometimes to fulfill strict duties. I have to draw on hypothetical imperatives. If I need to pay a bill, I need to know how to do it. That's a strict duty, right? And the whole dichotomy between strict duties and right duties is much less clear that he wants us to believe. So I agree. I think it's worth kind of, sitting on the pendulum, swinging back and forth. And I did swing in the direction of dichotomies and dualisms in this project, but it's not because I don't see the attraction of the other side of things. Now, about reaction and the demands of sensibility, I think I'm willing to bite that bullet, and I can tell you why. It's because if we don't bite the bullet, that even genetically, not normatively, we need the input of sensibility, and reason just reacts to sensibility. If necessary, of course, knocking sensibility on the head, we run the risk of incurring Hegelian empty formalisms, and we don't want to do that. We just don't want to go there, right? So it seems to be part of Kant's realism to say that we start with even a certain kind of anthropology that I've been trying to spell out to some extent, even though, of course, we can't end there. But if you pull the plug, if you remove sensibility from reason, from us as embodied beings, I think you end up with something like Stoicism, and Kant doesn't want to go there, it seems. And I resist the more Stoicizing interpretations of Kantian ethics precisely by emphasizing the dualisms that seem to be clearly operational, problematic though they may be. The Brandt quotation, I think that's spot on right. And towards the end of the book, I talk about the unambiguous nature of moral judgment, which I think is very surprising, right? That Kant says reason is altogether on the side of morals. So reason is not divided between the moral option and the non-moral option. Reason says there's no more or less here. You ought to do this no matter what, end of story, which of course is just another way of saying that the imperative is categorical. And if morality contradicts prudence, there is nothing, absolutely nothing in the eyes of reason to be said for the prudential option. Even though we may still decide to go with prudence, what may not be deserved to be called prudence at that stage, and do what is immoral. So I thought that was a very helpful point. And about prudence and the cultivation of abilities, I think this is sort of returning to the theme at the beginning of my response. Yes, we have to weave prudence and morality together again, but I think only once we've had, for reasons you've mentioned, heteronomy maxims based on the desire to be happy, not being fit to be universal laws, and so on. For that reason, I think we have to separate things first. And then we can see, well, does the cultivation of talents contribute to my happiness in all likelihood, and so on and so forth. So I didn't want to separate them unduly, but I think the separation is needed to see how we can make them interact again in the end. Thank you.
Okay, so let's thank Jens and the commentators. Thank you very much for this very interesting discussion. So now the floor is open for questions from the audience. So please raise your hand. Gudrun, you'd like to ask? Yes, you can also use the hand icon, but whatever you prefer. Gudrun, it's your turn. So you have to unmute yourself. Yes.
Me now. I
Yes.
want to say thank you so much for organizing this workshop, for Jens and the three commentators. I loved the book, and I loved particularly the first chapter, or on happiness, because it's nice to see that Kant has got an opening for a more human necessity. And I also want to ask you, Jens, about a problem that has puzzled me a lot. In the introduction to the doctrine of virtue, there is the remark that it is our duty to pursue our own perfection and the happiness of others. And obviously, we don't pursue our own perfection, our own happiness because we do that. That's not a duty, because we do that anyhow. And it's a duty to promote the happiness of others, the permissible happiness of others. But if that could lead to a dilemma. If I'm pursuing my own perfection, that means if I have the goal to be as morally consistent and dutiful as possible, I might have something to say about even permissible goals of others towards their happiness. And actually, Kant does say something about that. He seems to say that my own limits, or my own understanding of what is morally right thing to do, should have something to say about the desires or the happiness I promote in the other. Do you agree with that, Jens?
Thank you very much. And you were the first person to send me an email, I think sometime in July 2022, to say how much you enjoyed reading the book,
Yes.
which it cheered me up a lot. So thank you for that. And it's very nice to see you again, if only on a screen and not in person in Cambridge. And thank you for the question. Well, I think, as always, it's much more complicated than Kant makes it look. And he returns to our sort of moral judgments of happiness, the happiness of others in the doctrine of method of the doctrine of virtue, in particular in the casuistry, in the catechism. And the suggestion there seems to be, which doesn't answer all the problems, of course, that we are under no obligation to, in fact, we shouldn't provide people with means that help them fulfill their immoral projects. And that seems to be fairly clear, right? His examples are we shouldn't give lazy people cushions, and we shouldn't give drunkards bottles of wine to drink. Maybe not, I'm not sure. I feel more ambivalent about this than Kant, because it seems kind of paternalistic if you tell them, and may or may not be advancing your happiness. We don't know it for certain, but I'll be the judge of that on moral grounds. And I think the next question would be, well, should we discriminate between, say, acts of beneficence or even cases of rescue on the basis of our perceived virtue of the other person? So should I give priority to good people when I can only help one person and put bad people at the bottom of the list? And he doesn't say much about it, but I half suspect that's where the dividing line lies. I half suspect he would say, don't give people stuff that helps them being immoral, but given that we can't judge people's character really with any kind of certainty anyway, we should not prioritize cases of rescue on the basis of our perceived impression of their moral character. But I'm not entirely sure about that. And there may be other cases where we have to judge, or we're called upon to judge people's happiness in a moralized way. But those are the two things that come to mind.
Thank you.
Okay, Sina. Oh, Sina, we cannot hear you. You're not muted, but there was something with your audio, I think.
Sorry, can you hear me right
Yes.
now?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I'm in the empty room, so maybe there's some echo here.
It's fine.
Okay. Thank you for your lecture. Honestly, I didn't have time to read the whole book, but I could find some time to read your summary, and I really enjoyed your presentation and commentaries. I just had one brief question. If I understand it correctly, you said that in terms of practical reason, we just have this freedom to not to obey our moral judgment and not to obey what seems to be moral rules in Kant's moral philosophy. I would like to know what hinders us here to not to choose act morally and act against this moral principle. Is just only self-interest, or can we somehow assume more radical form of evil in Kant's moral philosophy? Just to paraphrase it, I would like to know if we just violate this moral principle. Is it just because of self-interest, or we can somehow suppose more radical form of evil that people choose to act evil by its own sake without any without any self-interest? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, we're in religion territory now. And maybe one sort of slight modification. In the introduction to the Metaphysics of Morals, in reaction to Reinhold's letters, Kant says we shouldn't define the freedom of choice in terms of departure from the moral law. And I think that makes good sense, but it's a conceptual point. So de facto, we can still depart from the moral law, but our freedom doesn't consist in being able to depart, rather because sensibility has the first word. It's kind of closer to us. We have to break away from sensibility. We have to define it the other way around, namely, freedom consists in being able to break away, being able to be determined by pure practical reason, and sometimes we don't. So that's the failure. But the failure is kind of, in a philosophically highly problematic way, an expression of our lack of strength or an inability, rather than something that is part of our ability, part of our capacity to be moral. So put it the other way around. But the question remains, of course, right? What is it ultimately that makes us do bad things? And I think there are two things to be said. The first and the easier thing is that Kant doesn't think that when we act immorally, we act to defy the moral law. That is something he would call diabolical in the book on religion, and it would presuppose an interest in doing what is immoral. And we don't have an interest, which would kind of be the flip side of respect for the law, kind of disrespect for the law. We just don't have it. We're not creatures like that, right? So whenever we act immorally, we act for the sake of inclination. And if I'm right in the book, we act because at that moment, we take it to be in our own self-interest. But the answer doesn't stop there, because that would make it mechanical, right? That would make it difficult to attribute free choice or responsibility or the ability to be moral at the same time. Yes, we act from self-interest, but the next question is, why do we privilege self-interest over morals? And my very reluctant answer to that is that Kant says we can't explain it further. We can say, I choose, end of story. We can explain choice in terms of maybe my history, my incentives, my habits, and so on. But given that I must have the ability to break away from that when I act immorally, why I still stick to the things that I've been doing in the past, or that seem to be most attractive, is something I can't do. So it is just really a brute choice. And the funny thing is that I said in response, I think, to Anastasia's point, that I take explicability to be an argument for my theory of hypothetical imperatives, both exegetically and philosophically. But here we have to bite the bullet and say, well, there is an element of inexplicability. Does it count against Kant's theory? Yes, of course it does, right? Because he's telling us, I can't say anything further. And as philosophers, we'd like to know a bit more why we choose the bad thing. But then we're once again, as in the response to Robinson's question, I think we're now in skepticism territory. And we're sort of reminded of what Galen Strawson says about free will, right? Freedom doesn't make sense. Determinism doesn't make sense. So we just have to throw our hands up in the air and say, we can't say anything about this. So I'm open philosophically to that suggestion, but I think exegetically it's crystal clear that Kant wants there to be a kind of irreducible choice of privileging of inclination as opposed to pure reason. So saying self-interest motivates me doesn't ultimately provide an explanation.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor.
Okay, the next question is from Eva Virewska.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. It's great to see you, Jens. Hope you still remember me.
Yeah, I do.
Very interesting topic. I had some doubts about this claim that there's no irrationality in prudential judgments, or maybe it's about judgments, it's not about actions, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we always just err when we don't do something wrong. We err about what is good or what is best, and I just think that it kind of puts a lot of what we do in terms of irrationality, in a sense that, like, if we do second best thing, or if we give up on something that is best altogether, then we are actually being irrational, or we have to always have good reasons while realizing our natural goal, which would be like our well-being, happiness, pleasure, or whatnot. And then I don't have an example. I'm just thinking if you could just argue or yeah. What if we are at least like we have two actions on par, then we just make a choice and choose one over the other, even though there is no good reason for that? That would be irrational. Or yeah, because that's this intellectual, or what if the prudential deliberation gives us an option and we choose not to do it, not because of moral considerations, but because we choose second best, or inaction at all. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Tricky. I think I'm first very inclined to say what I said to Anastasia. I think this is a problem for Kant. It's not a problem for me. But let's try to do our best helping Kant out here. And I agree that it is a problem. I mean, irrationality, of course, is a multiply ambiguous term, and that's why in the departure from early versions of the manuscript, I don't use it much. And the only kind of irrationality terminology I use is in the case of pure irrationality, which is the Korsgaard notion. And there I say it doesn't exist. But I tend not to describe things in terms of irrationality because again, it seems a pejorative term to use, right? You can't say I'm being irrational, which I think is part of your second best problem. But it's all right. So I think best not to be relied upon this kind of terminology too much. But you've mentioned two questions. So what about the second best? I choose second best, I don't choose the best. How are we to account for that? And there I think, well, we might just say we have a sense of it's good enough. Maybe the effort involved in going for the best is not worth it. Of course, then you might say what seems to us second best in some respect is still best, all things considered. That's something you could say. We don't need objective reasons to say the second best is the best, or the seemingly second best is the best, as long as the agent at the time of action is persuaded that what seems to be second best is in fact good enough or best or will do the job, right? So maybe the extra effort just wouldn't be worth it overall in the context of happiness, even though it would give us a better result, which is kind of a bit like the baking bread and making coffee examples I always discuss. Maybe sometimes drinking Nescafe is okay if you don't want to have a good time with a cup of coffee, but rather just get a quick fix of caffeine late at night at your desk. What about the symmetrical case? Well, now we're in Buridan's ass territory. And if I can I share my screen with you?
Well, give me a second. I need to switch it on for you. Yes,
okay.
But
it's not essential.
It should be possible now.
And where is the share screen function on?
It's at the bottom. It's the green one. Yeah.
Do you see this?
Yes.
I used this in Kladderadatsch in 1850 in my Stoicism and Skepticism lectures in first and second year. So, okay, what about Buridan's ass? I think it's a problem, right? If there's no, could I be paralyzed by two equally good choices and no reason to decide? Or does then some kind of meta principle of reason, if so, where does that come from, kick in to say toss a coin or plump or what have you? I do think this is not a Kant-specific problem, but I do think that Kant faces it. So we would have to say, I think, something like that, right? Let's toss a coin in that case. And most of us don't have that problem because we do have, we don't hesitate in supermarkets. Do I want this tin of baked beans or that tin of baked beans? Because we're right-handed or left-handed. Most of us have some kind of sense of, oh, well, let's grab this one. But I think philosophically, we may have to say a tiny bit more.
Okay, is that clear, or would you like to respond, Eva? No, it's fine. Yeah. Okay, Pavel.
Okay, thanks very much for the talk and to all the participants. I haven't read the book yet, but I had the same a similar question to Sinai about the thought that you can freely choose an immoral action. So this was something that you mentioned at the beginning, and I guess it's something that your account of practical failure in the moral realm relies on. So it's a hugely controversial claim that for Kant, that within the Kantian framework, you can freely choose to be immoral, or at least it was for the early post-Kantians in the 1790s. I haven't kept up with the literature since then, but I guess it's still discussed. And I guess one story is that Kant, you mentioned the metaphysics of morals, but also in the religion book that he changes and he introduces this whole mechanism of Villecourt and the intelligible choice and et cetera, et cetera. So you've said now that, well, I was going to ask you what you thought about that, but you've now said that it's sort of inexplicable. But I guess I want to ask then, in light of that, what do you think that Kant changed, or that he always had this idea of Villecourt in his back pocket? And if so, and this touches on the next question, it seems like with Villecourt, you get the Buridan's ass problem, because he says that the choice of good or evil or self-interest or morality cannot have any reasons. I can't remember. I think he's worried about either intelligible determinism or regress, but he says it has to be a kind of choice with no reasons. You just choose. And then you get the problem of sort of arbitrariness and flipping the coin again. So I guess where would you fall on that? Even if we can't explain, I mean, even if you can't explain why you choose, if he says that, well, it's inexplicable because there can't be an explanation or there can't be a reason, that seems to be different, slightly different. So yeah, I wanted to ask you about that, that set of problems.
Good, thank you very much. I think what we're heading towards is the worst systematic philosophical problem for Kantian ethics. So I do think that Kant ultimately has to bite a massive bullet, and that this may well, but who doesn't, right? So once again, we've got two choices. Either we choose the chap with the fewest bullets to bite, which is obviously Kant, right? Because we don't want to be utilitarians, and we don't want to be virtue ethicists, though they're nice people too. Or we become skeptics. So I think that, and becoming a skeptic, of course, is not a choice if you're a proper skeptic. You just at some point throw your hands up in the air and you say, I can't be bothered to think about stuff like that anymore because there are no good answers. It's not that, there are no good answers. It seems to be the case that there are no good answers. And I'm open to that suggestion. So I think ultimately I won't have a good answer for you. And that's because Kant doesn't have a good answer. But there are some matters of detail that I think we can still sort out along the way. The first thing that you mentioned is Villecourt, and as you suspect, I think it was there all along, and in section 35, I say as much, and there is an interesting quotation from the Powalski lectures, which in all likelihood date back to the early 1780s, Kant saying Villecourt and Wille are different, Willkür is the Wille that is practical, but Wille is not, Wille is not practical, or voluntas minus practica est. And there are similar noises around this passage. And that's exactly the Wille-Willkür distinction of the introduction to the metaphysics of morals. Also, there are two Latin terms, arbitrium and voluntas. Arbitrium has choice in it, right? Willkür has choice in it. Does Kant use these terms systematically and consistently ahead of, well, 1797 or 1793? No, he doesn't. He says things he shouldn't be saying in the light of what he's just, what I've just read out. Does he have the idea that there are two separate capacities within what is broadly called Wille? Absolutely, he does. And it's been there all along. He just didn't bother to spell it out. Does this solve the problem? No, because ultimately the choice of Willkür remains unintelligible. Again, a bullet that in the religion, it seems he is willing to bite in various footnotes. But you're right. I mean, he seems to fall into the trap of arbitrariness that at other points, reacting to the kind of Humean worry that a will that is not determined is arbitrary and therefore no better than a determined will, he seems very careful to avoid. Right? So what you end up with, I think, is he wants to minimize the problem of arbitrariness by saying there are only two forces that can determine us. Everything is determined in some shape or form. And yet we face a choice that can't be explained any further between two modes of determination. So I can determine myself to be determined this way. I can determine myself to be determined that way. What makes me choose the one or the other cannot be explained. And that is not a philosophically satisfying answer.
Okay. So are there further questions or comments? Maybe the commentators that are still in the room, that is to say, Anastasia, I don't know if you want to contribute something at this point.
Yeah, sorry, I'm happy I have the opportunity. I sort of thought, oh, it's sad I can't participate in the Q&A because I was ready to respond.
No, it's not like that.
Well, I suppose, I mean, one thing you said, Jens, is, I mean, the larger tenor of your response to my comments, the way I understood them was, which is fair, which is to say, well, perhaps you're right philosophically, but this isn't a problem for Kant.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I don't know. I mean, the question here is methodological. I do feel that, especially as far as your arguments for the impossibility of instrumental rationality are concerned, a lot of it is very philosophical. And it seems like, or at least some of your opponents, I mean, I really enjoyed the sort of dialectical provocation that you enter into, but
provocation, me? Surely not.
Sorry?
Provocation, me? No.
But I thought, I mean, you could call it anti-Andy, you can call it anti-Chris. This is fun. But I thought it was a bit, say, oh, okay, but it's not so maybe Kant is just wrong, because I felt you did, I felt you tried to defend the view, and I think sometimes you took pretty strong positions about why this is the view that Kant should have held. And so there, I sort of do want to push you a little bit to hear how you would philosophically defend it. So on both claims, well, I mean, I'll give you a dilemma, but sort of, there's something a bit unsatisfying. For instance, you say, okay, well, there's these cases, and I get, from a Kantian perspective, we just have to describe them as cases in which there is no, like you were saying, we're not going to take seriously the person who's crying over their bowl of ice cream or the person. So, Yeah, I'm not sure. So I want to hear more about why that is the case. And as for the moralized happiness, I mean, I guess that to sharpen the point, once we do start to put in philosophical considerations, I think it's clear that Kant is, I mean, like you say yourself, there are materials that people draw on when they defend a desire satisfaction account. That's not nothing. There are plenty of materials that you kind of bring to the fore to defend experientialist hedonism. But I think for me, as somebody who's sort of very much invested in Kantian ethics, there is a question of whether or not ultimately the account of happiness that he gives is one that is, I don't even think survives the ethics. It's sort of, is it from the standpoint of the mature practical agent, is that the conception of happiness we can still work with? So there's no doubt, depending how you understand a developmental account, if it's of the species or of the individual, or so I get all that, but the thought is that that's what we end up having at the end from a standpoint of a Kantian ethicist. That's sort of the question I would like to hear more about. And there's a footnote where you say, I didn't mention it, but there's in fact a footnote. It's a bit Kant, it's very Kant-like of you to put something very important in a footnote. I feel everything everything I do is in the footnotes in the Kant. And you say, you know, why would the fact that something basically is desirable and is permissible enough to think that we should go for it? Like that, why does that give us a reason? And you go, well, like, you could. Or that's how I read it. I need to find exactly where the footnote is. But I'm not so sure. And especially if we think of it as like, this is what we're going to dedicate our lives to. Somehow, ultimately, what we're doing is we're pursuing our happiness within the confines of the moral law. And the justification for that is, well, we want to, and we're allowed. So as opposed to, so what would a practical agent for whom, the moral law shines, they're free, they're trying to plan out their lives in light of this rational, practical commitment, full-blown practical rationality. How are they going to organize their lives? And so I find it very dissatisfying, the thought that it's just, well, we're going to see what I feel like doing and see if I'm allowed, and that's what I'm going to do. Considering just the amount of duties, perfect and imperfect, that I think would take complete priority and I would want to organize my life around.
Yeah. Thank you. Maybe very quickly, the methodology point, and I think you're spot on right. And as I said at the beginning, this may be less clear from the book as it is. I mean, I just had to return to the note of hedonism. I just had a lot of fun spelling it out the way I spelled it out, and I thought it deserves to be spelled out. And I do rely on philosophical arguments more in the absence of clear textual evidence than maybe in some other bits and pieces that I've done over the years. So, for me, it was just an exercise of trying to see whether we can make this work within the limits set by the texts, of course, but filling in the gaps left open by the text, and then to see whether we get a philosophically attractive picture. And the answer is, in some respects, yes, in other respects, no, for the reasons mentioned in the last discussion. Okay, so about moralized happiness, I think one thing worth emphasizing, and I don't think I did it in the book, is that Kant is at times less committed to the hedonistic picture that emerges, I think, in the groundwork of the second critique, the metaphysics of morals, because there are, for example, the reflections from the Duisburg Nachlass. And there he toys with the idea of a moralized conception of happiness that reminds us really of Stoicism. So I think he felt not entirely happy with hedonism. In the end, he did stick to it, it seems to me, but he was open to the suggestion, as we know, can change his mind, right? So his philosophy is not what 19th century scholars would have us believe, or what he himself wanted us to believe, that one big system, that kind of sprang from his head like Athene from the head of Zeus. It's not like that. He changes his mind all the time. He changes his mind about autonomy because it wasn't there in the first critique, and so on and so forth. So I think there's no reason not to try the moralizing bit, moralizing happiness bit. I still think it's something that contradicts a lot of what he says. So then we have to make a choice, right? Which way do we develop Kant's theory further because we think that it's unsatisfactory philosophically, or do we stick to the theory as we have it because we think it's still good enough? And maybe two points that it seems to me point to separating morals and happiness further. The one is the highest good, and constant criticisms of the Stoics, the Epicureans, basically everybody else, the rationalists, they see that there's a highest good, but they blur the distinction between the two elements. Second point is, and I think we discussed this in Mainz, for the most part, Kant seems to say that realizing moral ends doesn't give us pleasure. It contingently may give us pleasure because we have inclinations that coincide with our moral desires. But merely being moral just gives us contentment. And that's negative in the sense that it's the absence of pangs of conscience. It doesn't give us a positive buzz. So that, again, seems to point the direction of separating happiness and morals a bit further.
Okay, so Anastasia, maybe if you have time, maybe you can respond during the informal part. Is that okay? So then I give Wylan the floor for the final question.
Yes, good. Yeah, I wasn't sure. I was like, I'm happy to continue. So good. Okay. Thank you.
Okay,
Yeah.
Wylan, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, first of all, thanks to everyone for this interesting discussion, which inspires me with many thoughts and ideas. Since my background is not on Kant's moral philosophy, and I have not read the book for the discussion today, the questions that I'm going to raise would be somewhat basic, I would say. My questions concern the concept of inexplicability. That Kant, it has already been mentioned during the discussion that for Kant, there is a point where things cannot be expressed further. And do I understand it correctly that for Kant, the inexplicable part concerns why a person chooses a certain action, and beyond that, we cannot really say something more?
Yes, and in particular, why we choose to be immoral. Up to a point, choosing things that aren't good for us can be explained in terms of our beliefs and desires and how they interact. So in that case, an action would be an expression of our preferences and beliefs that we have at the time of action. But in the case of immoral action, that's precisely it. And explicability is that ties in with, of course, laws, right? We have a law that determines the action. And it also, in that case, a causal law, a law that determines the kind of shape the action takes. And there's a worry that Kant expresses at various points, for example, in the intro to the doctrine of virtue, that if we had a law, we would also be able to predict actions. So in that case, there's a prima facie problem for freedom. And he seems to come close to saying, if we can explain something, we can predict something, and that is predict in terms of the causal mechanism of the world. In that case, it can't be free. So there has to be an element of inextricability for an action to be free, imputable, and so on and so forth. But as philosophers, of course, we're not very happy with that answer. I have a question for you as well. Is there a harp behind you?
Oh, yes.
That's wonderful. It's more than one harp even, right?
Yes, indeed. Yeah. So my idea about the question of inexplicability is precisely that in modern times we often talk about the meaning of life, and the notion of meaning definitely has an influence on our choices. I am not sure if maybe I should say that I'm quite sure that Kant has not reached that level to inquire into the notion of meaning, but yeah.
Thank
maybe
you. You're spot on right. That's a very good point. And let's bracket the question whether we can make sense of meaning or whether we want to do without meaning, not without purpose or what have you, but without this distinct modern notion of meaning. And in fact, I've got another research project that comes very close to exploring this, because arguably the question of meaning is precisely the question that Maria von Herbert, in her correspondence with Kant, puts on the plate, and Kant doesn't have anything meaningful to say. So together with Bernhard Ritter, who is kind of the history of Maria von Herbert and her circle in Klagenfurt, and so on expert, we're editing a volume for OUP with a facing page translation of all the relevant documents, German and English, and a few essays by people we invited to contribute to this volume. And meaning is one of the big lacunae that people point to, saying Maria von Herbert is prompting Kant to say something about meaning because her life is meaningless, and Kant can't make sense of that because he's got happiness on the one hand, which is not the same thing as meaning. He's got morality on the other hand, which, well, maybe it's not quite the same thing as meaning either. And meaning kind of seems to be somewhere floating in the middle. And Kant just can't capture it, for better or worse, right? Once again, we may want to say, and that's good, because the notion of meaning is confused, or we may want to say there's something genuinely important here, and Kantian philosophy just can't capture it.
Oh, okay, yeah. Thank you, Professor.
Okay, very well. So there is room for other discussions about meaning and meaninglessness, but I guess we need to postpone these. So before I thank again the remaining speakers, I'd like to mention the next session of the Leuven seminar, which is on February 22. And Luca Corti will give a talk on Hegel's notion of character. So maybe there is a link with the current discussion. And then I also wanted to draw your attention to another online series of talks that we are co-organizing, and that is called the Virtual Kant Congress with a Cosmopolitan Purpose. And this is a series of events that spans the whole world of Kant scholarship. And we start somewhere March. Maybe you have already seen the announcement, but I'll put the link in the chat. And so evidently we hope to see you during one of these sessions too. I also wanted to remind you that after the conclusion, we'll leave open the Zoom meeting, so please stay on if you feel like it. And so I'd like to thank Jens Timmermann for a great presentation and discussion, as well as Anastasia and the commentators who had already to leave. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karen, for organizing this. Thank you.